Hi everyone, tonight's video is on evidence for evolution. So on a big scale, evolution is defined as descent with modification, which is not a helpful definition. What this means is that the characteristics of a population change over time, over many generations, to adapt to the environment. Individuals cannot evolve. That's a very important concept. Only the characteristics of a population can evolve over time. On a small scale, microevolution is defined as a change in the allele frequency in a population. So what evidence do we have that evolution has occurred? First of all, we have the fossil record in sedimentary rock. So you can look here at this picture of a cliff here, and can you see the horizontal stripes in this rock? This is indicative of sedimentary rock that forms from sediments forming in layers over time. And what you have is in this cartoon version, you can see that organisms die and they get covered by sediment, so dust and dirt. And over time, and the pressure of more dust and dirt forms rock and encapsulates the hard structures of the dead organism, ultimately forming a file. I think of these sedimentary rocks as a file cabinet with the older files at the bottom and the newer files at the top, because as more and more sediment forms and more organisms get caught, the newer organisms are formed near the top of the hill and the older organisms are formed near the bottom. So in this fossil layer, we can see changes in fossils over time as you see the same organism at different times dying and forming a fossil from an older layer to a newer layer. Fossils found in the rock can be plants, they can be insects, they can be land animals, or they can be marine organisms. What you see in fossils are the hard structures. You don't see any of the soft tissue remaining in a fossil. So homologous structures in distantly related animals is another way that we can show that evolution has occurred. What is shown here is the bone structure of the arm of a human, a dog, a bird, and a whale. And what you can see is each one of these has a bone called a radius and an ulna, and an ulna and a radius, and an ulna in a bird and a radius, and an ulna in a whale and a radius. And the fact that each of these distantly related animals has the same or very similar bone structure indicates that these organisms evolved from a common ancestor and that common ancestor had both a radius and an ulna. Another way that we can show that evolution has occurred is something called comparative embryology. So vertebrate fetuses have very similar structures at an early stage of development. This is a very famous drawing by a scientist named Ernst Haeckel from Germany in the late 1800s, and it's famous for wrong reasons. It is actually shown to be not true because this drawing is inaccurate. It has exaggerated similarities. But if we go back and look at this, it does show some basic true concepts, and that is that at early stages of development, the embryo of a human and a fish have a lot of similarities. They aren't quite as similar as this drawing indicates because he drew these to make them look a lot more similar than they actually are, but the basic concept is correct. Vertebrate fetuses do go through similar stages and have similar structures in early development. They just aren't quite as similar as this drawing indicates. This is another piece of evidence that demonstrates a common ancestor. So I've already given evidence that whales and humans have a common ancestor because they have that homologous bone structure. So whales are mammals. One of the definitions of mammals is they give birth to live young. Another is that they provide milk to newborn young, and whales do this. But mammals evolved on land. And if whales are mammals, that means mammals must have evolved on land. And if whales evolved on land, they must have been able to walk on land at one point. And that means they must have had legs. So that brings us to something called vestigial organs. The remnants of organs that are no longer needed, but that were needed in previous evolutions of an animal can still be found in their skeleton. And if we look at a sperm whale, we can see here the remnants of a pelvic bone. Whales used to be able to walk on land. You can look at a Greenland whale and see the same thing, the remnants of a pelvic bone. So this is another piece of evidence that demonstrates a common ancestor. Mammals all evolved on land, so they all had the ability to walk. Another piece of evidence is a little bit more difficult to understand, and this is based on an observation that similar organisms live in the same or similar locations due to similar natural selective pressures. We call this biogeography, or where things live. So let's look at the distribution of some different organisms around the world. So in this peach color, I have markings of where we find a certain land reptile. And in the green is where we find a specific type of fern. And then this blue is where we would find a freshwater reptile. So why do we find fossils of same or very similar organisms in such widely separated places around the Earth if they should live in similar locations due to the similar natural selective pressures? Well, did the Earth always look like this? No. Once upon a time, there was a big landmass called the Pangea, and at that time, the continents were connected. So we can see our land reptile spread out across South America, but also Africa when they were connected. And in this time when they were connected, there were similar natural selective pressures because these were similar environments in terms of precipitation and heat and predators and things like that. The same with the land reptile and the fern and the freshwater. So because the Earth has evolved too, during the time of the Pangea, the land masses were together and the animals were able to traverse these large areas. This shows a change over time. There's another piece of evidence called the DNA code, which shows the relatedness of different species. So if we look at humans and we look at one specific protein in their electron transport chain in their mitochondria, if we look at the same protein in the electron transport chain of chimpanzees, we will see that that protein in chimpanzees has exactly one amino acid difference from the humans. Now, the amino acid code is generated from the code in DNA. So if there's one amino acid difference, that means that the DNA only differed by one codon between humans and chimpanzees. If we look at that same protein in the electron transport chain in the mitochondria of cows, we find that there's 10 amino acids difference. So that means that the cow DNA had 10 codons that were different from the human DNA. If we look at that same protein in a frog, we see 20 amino acids different. And if we look at that same protein in a fern, we see 42 amino acids difference. So we can see that humans from the DNA code are much more closely related to chimpanzees than we are to cows or frogs or fern. This is another piece of evidence that demonstrates change over time because that protein in the electron transport chain changed over time as these different organisms evolved. So from these 6 pieces of evidence, we know that evolution has occurred. You should know how each piece of evidence shows that evolution has occurred. You should also be able to support whether each piece of evidence shows a change over time or evolution from a common ancestor. So that's all for tonight.